Well, welcome everybody once again to the second annual lecture series hosted by the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies in conjunction with the Dhammachayi International Research Institute of New Zealand. We're grateful once again to DIRI for their ongoing support and hope that our academic partnership continues long into the future. So this is the second lecture of the series. Last week we had a lecture on Burmese medieval grammar by Dr. L.A. Ruiz-Falquez. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Alice Collett from the University of St. Andrews, talking on gender and Buddhist doctrine. Professor Collett is a specialist in ancient Indian religion. Her research focus to date has been on women in early Indian Buddhism. Her publications include Women in Early Indian Buddhism, Comparative Textual Studies from 2013, and Lives of Early Buddhist Nuns, Biography as History, 2016. She was also the editor of Translating Buddhism, Historical and Contextual Perspectives from 2021. Professor Collett's current projects include an outreach project that offers workshops to primary and secondary school students in and around Scotland on South Asian history, and also a collaborative project with the School of Computer Science working on digital tools for ancient inscriptions. I'm glad to say that during this academic year, 2024-25, she's a research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies. So just before I welcome Professor Collett to give her lecture, I just remind everybody that this is being live streamed. So if you don't wish to be seen live on YouTube, please turn off your video. If you'd like to ask any questions, please send a message via the chat application on Zoom to Stephen, or else just raise your hand at the end. So here is Professor Alice Collett.
Hey, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies for inviting me to give this lecture today. So the first thing I'll do is share my screen so I can get my PowerPoint up. And just give me a minute to do that. So can somebody confirm that you are seeing the audience view and not the presenter view?
Yes, we got that, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about gender and Buddhist doctrine. I have talked about some aspects of that in some other publications of mine over the years. As was said in the introduction, women in Buddhism or women in ancient Indian Buddhism is a particular research specialism of mine. So in a book that I published in 2021, I Hear Her Words, An Introduction to Women in Buddhism, I did particularly talk about gender and Buddhist doctrine in that book. And what I'm going to do today is follow on from the research that I did in that book, particularly focusing on various aspects that I didn't cover in the book. So, but I will start with just a basic introduction of some of what I did in the book, so you can see how what I'm doing today follows on from that. So often with regard to Buddhism and women, we ask questions about what the texts say about women and how traditions treat women. So in the book instead, I center on a new historical narrative which centers the lives of women in the history of Buddhism. And what I say in the book is we are in a very good position now after decades of scholarship on the lives of women in Buddhism, really excellent scholarship unveiling many different lives across many different cultures and many different countries. So actually, what I argue in the book is I would like a shift to happen whereby when we think about women in Buddhism, instead of thinking about how Buddhist traditions treat women or what texts say, we think about the actual lives of the actual women who really lived in history, who contributed to Buddhism in multiple ways and helped shape Buddhism and make it what it is today. So that's one central theme of the book, and the other one is engaging with Buddhist doctrine, which I just have one chapter on. and ask questions relating to whether there's anything in Buddhist doctrine that says women are inferior to men. So rather than just looking at what texts say in general or how traditions treat women, I'm looking at Buddhist doctrine in particular. So what I do is I use Buddhist doctrine to challenge some of what Buddhism says about women. So two of the core doctrine that I talk about, and it is an introductory book, are dependent arising and the doctrine of no self. So as I said, I'll just briefly go over these two and what I said in the book about these before turning to the new research. So I think that most of you listening to this talk will understand basic Buddhist doctrine. So dependent arising being the idea that all things arise in dependence on conditions, nothing exists independently, and when conditions cease, that thing ceases. So the dependent arising then is part of the idea within Buddhism that there's nothing fixed, permanent, static, and unchanging to what exists in the world. But what we find when we find Buddhist texts talking about the inferiority of women, or rather quite often suggesting rather than specifically saying, suggesting some sort of inferiority to women, there are two things specifically that are talked about. These are women's nature on the one hand and women's bodies on the other. Now, when I say women's nature is talked about, it's not the case that there are concrete cases, if you like, of something called women's nature, which is defined completely, and then that's said to be inferior to something defined as men's nature. In fact, it's more like offhand comments saying that, well, women are all jealous, deceitful, manipulative, and have a low level of intelligence. So what this suggests then, in contrast to the idea of dependent arising, is that there's something fixed, permanent, static, and unchanging about this idea of female nature. So, for instance, if women are inferior to men because of these aspects of their nature, that they're jealous and deceitful, presumably that means that they have to be jealous and deceitful all of the time, because the suggestion is they're inferior all of the time. And actually, as we know, jealousy is just one mental event or emotional state, we could say, that comes into being and passes away. Looking at it in the context of dependent arising, we can say that conditions happen, and I think that theories of psychology say that jealousy arises when someone feels threatened. So a condition might happen whereby we feel threatened, thereby jealousy arises in us. But then when that event that happened that made us feel threatened no longer makes us feel threatened, then the jealousy goes away. So each of these things, and I'm going to say probably each of us has experienced these things. We've experienced jealousy, been deceitful, been manipulative, etc. So each of these things we know is part of the flux and flow that is what underpins this idea of dependent arising. Things come into being, pass away, they come into being, pass away. Jealousy comes into being and passes away. So then I hope you can see then from what I've said, if we are going to say that women are inferior because of this, then that really doesn't sit actually with core doctrine like the doctrine of dependent arising. Now, the other thing that's said here that I've got here is women have a low level of intelligence. So if that's the case, then I think we would have to say there's something core and different between a man and a woman, whereby we can say women are less in this way than men are. So this is something that I'm going to look at more in this talk and in this research that I'm doing now. So again, then the Buddhist doctrine on the self, no fixed, permanent, unchanging self. the self is causally conditioned, and the human being consists of skandhas or khandhas, that is, aggregates or constituent parts, which are form, feeling, will, perception, and consciousness. And these are all that the human being is. So, therefore, then, with regard to this question, and particularly if we're looking for some way in which women are different to men, whereby Buddhist doctrine says women are different to men, whereby this idea of a low level of intelligence we can find in Buddhist doctrine, it must be somewhere here that we can find it, if it's possible to find it. So then do women and men have different skandhas? So is the form of a woman, her feelings, perception, will, consciousness, different to that of a man? So this is the section of the talk which I'm going to talk about, which is my new research. So I'm going to talk about the skandhas, and I'm going to talk about Indriya particularly. So Indriya are faculties, and there are said to be faculties that distinguish men and women. So they're said to be female Indriya and male Indriya. So the meaning of the word Indriya, likely, potentially actually, that not everybody agrees, relates to the god Indra, and means something with power or domination over a particular thing, which will become clear when I talk about them a bit more. So in Buddhist texts, there are specific things that are said to be Indriya, which are, for instance, and there's a group of them, and there's a list, but everything in there comes to be a list of 22, which I'll go into, but that's not all that's classed as Indriya. There are other things, because the list seems to have developed over time and become established over time. So in Buddhist texts, we have the sense organs and sense experience being called Indriya, faculties that enable progress on the path. And just in order to distinguish that set from the other Indriya that I'm talking about, I'm going to call them spiritual faculties. I don't really like that as a way of talking about them, but otherwise I really just need to say the Indriya that enable us to make progress on the path. I couldn't think of another way to distinguish them from the other Indriya. So firstly, then I want to talk about the skandhas or khandhas as doctrine, and then Indriya as doctrine, and then I'm going to go on to talk about male and female Indriya. So the khandhas as doctrine, then we have things being said such as we have here from the Samyutta Nikaya. Monastic, so I teach you things that should be understood, and also full understanding. Listen to that. And what is something that should be fully understood? Form is something that should be fully understood. Feeling, perception, will, consciousness. Consciousness is something that should be fully understood. These things should be fully understood. And what is full understanding? The destruction of lust, the destruction of hatred, the destruction of delusion. This is full understanding. And then with regard to the Indriyas as doctrine, it's these ones that I'm calling the spiritual faculties that are the ones that are said particularly to be doctrine. So again, from the Samyutta Nikaya, monastics, there are these 5 faculties. What 5? The faculty of faith, the faculty of energy, the faculty of mindfulness, the faculty of concentration. When a practitioner understands these faculties, they are liberated and attain nirvana. And this is repeated several times in different ways to emphasize the point. So rather than saying, if we understand these, we attain nirvana, the text sometimes says we're liberated by non-clinging. It's done what has to be done. The practitioner's reached the goal and is liberated through final knowledge, etc. So we can see these things. There's some yellow appearing on the screen there for anyone else. There's some yellow lines appearing on the slide from my point of view. Can anyone else see them?
I can, yes. I suppose we all can. I have no idea why those. It must be coming on your side, Alice, but don't worry about it.
Yes, Gupta, this seems to be coming from you. Could I please ask you to clear your whiteboard?
I'm not finding it a problem.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to carry on. Sorry about that. Just seems strange When yellow lines appearing. So where was I? Okay, yeah. So here we can say then these 5 spiritual faculties clearly are doctrine, because if a practitioner understands them and practices them, then they can attain nirvana through doing so. Then we come on to male and female Indriya, and there's very little said about these in the canon. And the Indriya Samyutta from the Samyutta Nikaya says only monastics, there are these 3 faculties. What 3? The feminine faculty, the masculine faculty, the life faculty. These are the 3 faculties. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi, in the notes to his translation of the Samyutta Nikaya, particularly points to this as odd in his view. For all of the other connected discourses that are in the Samyutta Nikaya, he says, all other connected discourses are on one single closed group. So thereby what he means is, in the connected discourses on the Skandhas, they just talk about the 5 Skandhas, and in the connected discourses on other topics, they just talk about one aspect of the other topic. Now, this Indriya Samyutta is 41 pages in English translation, and these are the only lines which mention the female Indriya and the male Indriya. All the rest of it is on these things that I'm calling the spiritual faculties. So Bhikkhu Bodhi's view, therefore, is that I don't think he specifically says this may have been added. Oh, he might actually, sorry. He might say these are likely added. And actually, if we wanted to think about other canons, in the Chinese, there's only, I think, 19 of the sutras and the Samyutta Agama still extant, and we don't have a parallel of this there either. So it's quite possible then that this is added into the canon, and potentially then this idea of the female Indriya and the male Indriya is something that's more from the Abhidharma classification than being canonical. Now, we do find these things mentioned in a few other instances. And with regard to this one, so part of what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to think about and find is the relationship of all these passages to doctrine. So I think here, how this one relates to doctrine is this is about desire. And actually that we're trying to, one part of what we do as a Buddhist, or we might do, is to try and move beyond desire, is to try and overcome desire. And this is really the fullest section we have on something that we might call female Indriya in the canon. So I'll read out monastics. And I should say, so I just put here the one that's on women, and there's a parallel passage, which I think is underneath, or it might be above it, on men. So it's the other way around. It's a man who attends to his male faculties. Yeah, although this passage on the woman is repeated elsewhere, and the passage on the man isn't repeated elsewhere. But here it's exactly the same. We've got the woman and her feminine faculties, and then the man and his masculine faculties. A repeated passage, just the same. So, monastics. A woman attends inwardly to her feminine faculties, her feminine charms, behaviors, ways, desires, her female voice and feminine adornments. She is excited by that, takes pleasure in that. Being excited and pleased, she attends outwardly to masculine faculties, masculine charms, manners, ways, desires, the male voice and male adornment. She is excited by that, takes pleasure in that. Being excited and pleased, she longs to be bonded with that which is outside her, longs for whatever happiness and joy arises based on that bond. A woman takes pleasure in her femininity, goes into bondage in relation to men. In this way, monastics, a woman does not overcome her femininity. So as I say, this is really the most that we have on the idea of female Indriya in the canon. In the canons, although it is mentioned some other places as well. But my argument here is this is simply about, in the way that this relates to doctrine is simply and only about desire and how we have to try and overcome desire. So not everybody agrees with that, and Jose Cabazon, in his book called Sexuality in Classical Indian Buddhism, says that here he wants to say that here we have something which is an attempt at a delineation of gender identity. Now, I don't agree with that, and I would say, yes, if this was saying something like there are, I mean, I understand what he means, and he's saying that this is suggestive of a kind of stereotyping of men and women. But actually, I would say, unless it was saying these are particular behaviors, for instance, Buddhaghosa, and I'll come on to this later, says that with regard to behaviors, women play with dolls, girls play with dolls when they're children. And I think that we can understand and say is a type of stereotyping. But here, to say this is the stereotyping means we have to read into what behaviors it is the text is supposed to be telling us are called female behaviors, which the text doesn't say. Okay. So like I say, then there's really not much in the canons about these idea of Indriyas, and it's more in the Abhidharma analysis that we find them. So generally in Abhidharma analysis, we find a list of 22 Indriyas, but the list of 22 seems to be something that became established over time. And when we look at the Dhammasangani in a minute, we're going to see something a bit different to the 22. So it became established over time, and it came to be it seems some sort of general consensus that there are 22, which I'll go into what they are in a minute. So male and female Indriyas almost always appear on this list of 22, and most often in a collection of 8 or 9. So with the 5 sense faculties, it's the 5 sense faculties, male and female Indriya, life force Indriya, and then sometimes mind as well. But importantly, coming back to the Skandhas, male and female Indriya and this collection actually are always classified only under Rupa. Rupa only, never any other of the Skandhas. And coming back to this question of a low level of intelligence for women, or questioning whether there's something called female consciousness or male consciousness that we can find any doctrinal support for, here, when we talk about the Indriyas, and the Indriyas I think are the closest we can get to that, they're always only classified as Rupa only. So Rupa form, physical form. Now, Rupa is said to be a support to the mind, but that doesn't mean that it's the same as mind. And I'll go on to what it means to say that Rupa is a support to the mind in a moment. But before that, I just want to talk about sense consciousness. So again, those of you who know about Buddhism and know about Buddhist doctrine will be quite aware of this idea of sense consciousness. So actually, to go back to this one. So when we have male and female Indriya in this collection, it's in a collection with the 5 senses, which is why I want to talk about the senses and sensory experience next. So as I say, those of you who know about Buddhism will know that there are Buddhist texts talk about something called eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, etc. And also, I think that these ideas are very easy for us to understand, being that we are sensory beings. So we understand, I think, that our sensory experience of the world is a relationship between what our senses experience and our mind or our consciousness. So that, for instance, when a sense organ experiences vision, then it sends messages to the mind, and the mind interprets the sensory experience. And I think that's, it is not different from a scientific point of view of what happens to a sensing object, a sensing being like a human being. So I think that's really quite straightforward. But coming back to this idea of, as I say, I'm raising this question of female consciousness. Does that come in anywhere here? So again, as I said, male and female Indriya are contained within the Rupa Skandha, and within this definition of types of consciousness relating to senses, they come under body consciousness, so relating to touch and tactile objects. Now, this, I would say, is it's hard to really make sense of why you would want to distinguish between male and female on the level of the sense of touch. Because obviously, I would say, obviously, when a female body is touched, and that touch is felt within the body sends information to the brain, and the brain interprets the touch. Those processes we understand as happening as it's exactly the same way in human bodies. It's not the case that that process happens differently with regard to a female or a male. Now, again, Cabazon does mention this, and his understanding of it is this must be talking about something like particular sense receptors in the genitals, because, like I say, this is about body. So yes, maybe we can say it is, but I would say it isn't really clear exactly why we've got male and female differentiated at this point, which I'm going to come back to actually, because I think it's often not clear why we've got male and female differentiated within these schema of Indriya and existing in the way they do in the schemas. So I now turn to looking at 3 different texts. So the Dhammasangani, one of the 7 books of the Theravada Abhidharma, Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha Bhasham, and Sarasthavadin, and then Attasalini, Buddhaghosa's commentary on the Dhammasangani. So in these texts, we do find a bit more discussion of male and female Indriya, and these do appear as well in some other Abhidharma texts, but not so comprehensively. In other Abhidharma texts, they are parts of lists of things, lists and categorizing. But it's here that we find a bit more being talked about in relation to them. So the Dhammasangani, first of all, again, as in all these cases, male and female Indriya simply classified as Rupa. So here classified as Rupa and the 5 senses. So it's the 5 senses plus the 3 Indriya that we found before, male and female and life force. And Caroline Rees-Davids, in her introduction to this text, raises the question as well. So not clear really why these things might be grouped together. Now, since Caroline Rees-Davids published that, which was in 1900, there's been a lot of scholarly discussion of the Skandhas and, well, all of this, and particularly, for instance, whether the Rupa Skandha, we can say, corresponds to the scientific idea of matter. So, Caroline Rees-Davids has a way of understanding this, which I think might sound rather simplistic or overly simplistic, but when I read it, it did make sense to me, and it made more sense to me when I was than anything else I read as in answer to a question as why we might have these things grouped together. So what she said is that Rupa is things that we see. So actually, when we do see a person in front of us, the person that we see is someone who does have senses as we have senses, and we can see that they have eyes, ears, nose, etc. We can see that they're male or female, and we can see that there's a life force within them animating the being, as it were, enabling the being to be alive. So I quite like this idea of Rupa as things that we see in relation to answering the question, why do we have all these things, these particular set of things together? So then when we look at this text, we'll see there's some of these same aspects of male and female Indriya that we found in the sutta before in the sorry, it was the Samyutta Nikaya. I've got the Anguttara Nikaya there. No, it was the Anguttara Nikaya, that's right. Some of the similar aspects of female Indriya that we came across already, we find again in the Abhidharma. So it's not exactly the same list. There are a few members of the list that we can see are similar, but we also have Linga, Nimitta, Ithata, and Itibhava. And some of these will become important later on, particularly when we look at Buddhaghosa's analysis of this text. Okay, so this is the list of 22 Indriya. And as I say, we don't find this adhered to fully in all of the texts, but it does seem to have come to have been a standard list. So we see, first of all, the senses and sense experience, then female, male, and life faculty. Then what happens, 10 to 14 are what happens when our sensory organs kind of kick in, if you like, and give us sensory experience of the world. And again, this is standard basic Buddhism here. That when we have experiences of the world, we have pleasant, painful, and neutral feelings. And then 15 to 19 are these, what I was calling the spiritual faculties, the ones that if we practice them, the ones that comes to be the standard list of 22, and I'll say a bit more about that as I go on. So with regard to female Indriya and the mind, there are 3 pairs of questions in the Dharma Sangani, which the answer to them actually is female Indriya is not connected to the mind. So the pairs of questions are, what is form that originates from the mind and what is form that does not originate from the mind? What is form that comes into being with the mind and what is form that does not come into being in the mind? What is form that is connected with the mind and what is form that is not connected to the mind? And as I say, in each case, female Indriya and male Indriya are said to be not connected to the mind. Now, it probably won't come as any surprise to you that the idea and the thrust of this section is not to tell us what Indriya are not connected to the mind, but actually to tell us what Indriya are connected to the mind. And here we move away from the list of 22 and particularly highlighted our 2 Indriya to do with speech and to do with physical behavior. And these are said to be connected to the mind. So the way that I understand what the text is trying to say here is that my speech as I'm talking to you is connected to the mind and originates in the mind and couldn't exist in this moment without my mind. I couldn't be speaking to you in this moment without my mind. I'm moving my hands while I'm talking, and this physical behavior that I'm exhibiting is connected to my mind and comes from my mind and couldn't exist and couldn't be happening in this moment without the mind. However, from the start of the talk to the end of the talk, I have remained female all of that time. I have done and I will. And that isn't in this moment connected to my mind. And also, if I was asleep, I would still be female. And so in that way, it's not connected to the mind in the way that my speech and my physical behavior are in this moment. Because with regard to my speech and physical behavior, they couldn't be happening in the way that they're happening without them being connected to the mind in the way that they are. So this is really what is attempted. The attempt is to specify in relation to Indriya that are connected to the mind. And as I say, almost, but I say incidentally, but I think it is important as well, but in some way incidentally, the other Indriya that are not connected to the mind are said to be not connected to the mind. And that is important for the points that I'm trying to make. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Vasubandhu now. Well, I'm just going to have a drink. Please excuse me while I have a drink. So then this list of 22 Indriya come up again for Vasubandhu, and with regard to the question of female Indriya, here again, part of Rupa, the Rupa Skandha, only again, and here Rupa and elements of it again support the mind. But here the schema of 22 Indriya are developed. So Vasubandhu says about the 22 Indriya, he talks about actually how they relate to mind. So he says about the 6 sense organs, they relate to mind by supporting the mind. He says about the male and female Indriya, that support is differentiated into 2, and I'll come back to that. And the 2 are the male and female Indriya. So the life force supports the mind because the mind lasts as long as the life force lasts. I've got the list in, I'll show you the list again in a minute. So the sensations, pleasant, painful, or neutral, these are what defile the mind, and what purifies the mind are the Indriya that if we practice them, we make progress on the path to awakening, and purification is assured by understanding. So there's the list again to remind you of the list. So I think we can easily see some of these, such as the sense organs and how the sense organs operate are a support to the mind. We can see that the mind is defiled by having sensory experience. Again, I think this is kind of basic Buddhism. If we practice certain things that strengthen us overall in our practice, then we move forward in the path, and understanding helps. And again, I would say this idea of differentiation into 2 here, male and female Indriya. So basically this is saying then, so we're here at Rupa, this is the Rupa Skandha, and the Rupa Skandha supports the mind, and aspects of it support the mind, and these Indriyas support the mind. And this support for the mind happens to be differentiated into 2, male and female. But again, there's not said, it's not that here there's anything specific about the support that's male in particular or female in particular. So here I think we simply have again the male and female Indriya understood to be Rupa, to be form only. They're part of this schema, so therefore when you're creating a kind of justification for this schema, there has to be a place for them within that, and the place for them within that is simply saying here the support for the mind that is the body exists in 2 different types, and the 2 different types are male and female, and that's really all that's being said about the difference between male and female here. Okay, so lastly on Vasubandhu, I will just add that he also says that our experience of nirvana is free from signs or characteristics, nimitta, and what some of the signs or characteristics we're free from are these male and female characteristics. So moving on lastly then to the Atasalni, Buddhaghosa's commentary on the Dhamma Sangani. So as we might expect from a commentary, with regard to these particular aspects of male and female Indriya, Buddhaghosa does comment on them each in particular. So as I say, as we would expect from a commentary, this is the sort of thing we would expect to happen. So with regard to linga or features, I think we can translate it as here. He says that the shape of a woman's body differs from that of a man, i.e. women have smaller hands. With regard to nimitta, mark or sign or characteristic, women's breasts are different, and women have no beard or moustache. And then with regard to behaviours, as I mentioned before, here he does move into something we could potentially call maybe a little bit of stereotyping, saying that with regard to behaviours, girls will play with dolls and baskets and they weave. And then with regard to deportment, there's a gait or a way of moving that through which we might identify, be able to identify or differentiate a male from a female. And then Itibhava and Itata, he says he discusses those two together and says they are born of karma and produced at the moment of conception. So this is really actually adding something, I would say. Here he starts to add something. And he does go on from there to make some judgments. But importantly, his judgments are not about female Indriya. So he says, he uses the term linga here, and he says in relation to the two, the male sex is superior, the female sex inferior. Now, I'm not sure whether to translate linga here as sex, as he's just used it in two previous instances where he talks about, for instance, as I say here, a better translation here would, I think, be features or shape or something like that. So the shape of a woman's body differs from that of a man. I don't think it's too much of an extension to say he might have a slightly different meaning to the term across three different paragraphs. But actually, my point here isn't to do with how linga is translated, but my point here is actually to do with the fact that he does not use the word Indriya when he talks about men being superior to women. So after this, he does go on to making some moral judgments and saying that it's a little bit convoluted what he says, but he does seem to be suggesting that a male form will come about, or, you know, he starts to say this is karma and this is moment of conception, as I showed you on the last slide. And he does seem to be suggesting that someone who has a stronger morality about them is more likely to be born a man than to be born a woman. But in each of these three cases, so Atta here, Itibhava, and then linga, as you can see, he's not using the word Indriya. And I think that's very interesting, because to me, what that says is that Buddhaghosa can see what I hope that I have showed you in this talk, which is that all Indriya are in this system of classification are simply classification into a male and a female body. So there's no suggestion of anything other here. There's no suggestion relating to any of the other skandhas, so perception, will, consciousness, etc. And it seems to me, as I say, I think Buddhaghosa is aware of that and is honoring that. So even though he does want to make judgments and to particularly say there's something about maleness that's superior and femaleness inferior, it seems to me he is respecting the Abhidharma classification, and that the Abhidharma classification is neutral, if you like, in simply a classification into male and female without making any judgment about them. So to conclude then, so Abhidharma attempts a comprehensive survey of doctrine with explicit intention to delineate and define human consciousness and the human mind. And there's no mention of female consciousness as differentiated from male consciousness. And as I hope that I've shown, human beings simply exist in two differentiated categories, male and female, and this is simply description of the way things are. That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. Extremely interesting lecture, and I have a couple of questions, but first of all,